Good morning, everyone, and happy Father's Day. Thank you so much for joining us here online. If this is your first time or 100th time joining us, we're so glad you've decided to connect with us this morning. If you are new, we would like to ask you to take a moment and fill out a Connect card by clicking the Connect button that was just dropped in the chat window, or by going to lakesawyerchurch.org/next. We would love the chance to tell you about Lake Sawyer and all that God is doing through this awesome community. More importantly, we want to get to know you. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Lake Sawyer.
Okay, dads, let's go ahead and get started, guys. Now, some of you've already let me know how uncomfortable you were in last week's meeting. So tonight, we're gonna try to respect each other's boundaries.
What?
Tonight, we've also got a guest with us, David. And would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm David.
What's up, David?
How many kids do you have, David?
None. At least not at the moment. My wife is pregnant, and she should be delivering any day now.
That's great.
Super.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Who'd like to go first? Anyone? Anyone?
I'll go.
Perfect. Todd? Yes.
My daughter and I went to the mall, and she said she wanted to take the stairs to the second level. And I said, I don't trust stairs because they're always up to something.
Todd, I'm sorry that happened. I encourage you to try to resist the urge to make jokes like that.
My turn? Okay, can I go? Okay. Yesterday, actually, my daughter got home and she asked me how my day was. And I said, well, a guy tried to sell me a coffin, but that's the last thing I need.
Oh, Jerry, that joke was dead on arrival.
Because it's the last thing I need.
David, how about you?
Oh, I didn't say
This is a safe zone. Just jump on in.
Yeah, I guess I'm just scared of being a dad. I'm afraid I'm gonna start telling bad jokes just like my dad.
Well, it might be in our nature. We can fight against it.
Hey, speaking of nature, I tried to catch some fog yesterday. I missed. M-I-S-T.
You're a monster. This is where the boundary is.
I'm done.
This is where you are.
Hello? Really? Okay, yeah, no. Yeah, I'll be right there. That was Julie. Her water just broke. I guess the baby finally ran out of womb. I'm gonna be a dad.
Don't you think you should be going?
Oh, yeah.
So I told my wife she drew her eyebrows too high. She seemed surprised.
I raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies, and I raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief, and I raise a hallelujah. My weapon is a melody.
Each week as a community, we take what is called communion. The night before Jesus went to the cross, he gathered his disciples, broke bread to symbolize his body that was given for us. He then took the cup and told us that it represents his blood that was freely poured out for us. As a community of Jesus followers, we take communion to remember him and the sacrifice he made for us so that we could choose to be in a relationship with him. If you haven't come to the point in your spiritual journey where you feel comfortable taking communion, please don't feel any pressure to do so. To be clear, you do not have to believe yet to be welcomed here at Lake Sawyer. We are honored that we get to be a part of your spiritual journey, and we will do everything we can to answer any questions you have. If you do have questions at any time in the service, just press the live prayer button and someone will join you in a private chat window. For the rest of us, grab some bread and some juice, and in the next minute or so, take communion wherever you are.
You were the Word at the beginning, one with God the Lord Most High. Your hidden glory in creation, now revealed
Through recent times, we have found new ways to serve our community as we continue to work to help people find and follow Jesus. For those of you who already give to Lake Sawyer, thank you for continuing to partner with us in your faithful generosity. You are making a difference in our community. If you'd like to give, you can do so by going to our website at lakesawyerchurch.org/give, or you can text Lake Sawyer to 77977. You can also go to our Lake Sawyer app, which is available on your preferred app store.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to England, to travel to Cambridge University, to spend a summer studying abroad. And I was incredibly excited to be able to go to Cambridge. I started to think about all the incredible intellectual minds that once called that place home. People like Charles Darwin and Sir Isaac Newton. C.S. Lewis lived there for many years. And now I had the privilege to be able to go to walk some of the same grounds that these brilliant minds walked. An opportunity to be in places that are steeped deeply in history. I was also excited for the trip because I love to travel internationally. It's one of my favorite things to do. I love to go into other countries, experience other cultures, see how people live, in many ways very similar to us, in some ways different than us. I also knew I would like England because they speak English. And one of the most awkward things when you're ever traveling overseas is just to encounter the language barrier, to get over that obstacle. But I knew I could talk to someone and someone could talk to me. I also love public transportation. And the United Kingdom has some of the best public transportation that there is. And so I was excited to be able to go, to ride buses and trains and the underground to get to the places that I needed to get to, knowing that I was going to visit a few different cities while I was there. So I did everything I needed to prepare myself for the trip, laid out sort of my itinerary to get to where I wanted to go, made sure I had all my T's crossed and my I's dotted. The night before departure, I packed everything up I needed. The next morning, I boarded the plane, flew throughout the day to London. I landed at Heathrow Airport. And when I departed from the plane, I immediately walked to baggage claim, grabbed my stuff, and I went straight to the train depot. This was the moment. This was when it was all beginning to come together. I had never, ever been on public transit in the United Kingdom. And here I am standing, waiting for the train to arrive. When the train finally pulled up, the doors opened and the PA system there at the station announced something. Do you know what it announced? If you've ever been to England, you know what it announced. It said, "Mind the gap." I love that term. I'm such the corny tourist. I went around probably the rest of the time I was there just saying to people, "Mind the gap, mind the gap." I went a few years after this with my wife. She got sick of me saying, "Mind the gap." I'm the guy that buys the magnet that says, "Mind the gap." Now that phrase got me thinking, where did this come from? Why did they use this? What was it intended for? In 1968, the rail authority in England recognized how improbable and how financially impossible it would be to continue to have people standing on the platform employed to help other people understand that there was a gap that they had to be mindful of. See, the way that the trains were originally built, there wasn't much of a gap, but as trains got faster, as trains got more efficient, they got smaller, and a gap formed between many of the platforms and the train. If you would step in that gap, maybe at best you twist an ankle, probably at worst you would severely injure yourself. And so as a country, England, they thought, let's have people there to help make sure no one steps in the gap. But when the costs continued to rise for employing these people, they replaced people with an alert. Mind the gap. Now that phrase got me thinking a lot about words from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we come across a prophet whose name is Ezekiel. Ezekiel lived roughly 600 years before the birth of Jesus. He was originally born in the land of Israel, but for most of his adult life, he lived in exile after the people of God were captured and moved from their ancestral homeland into Babylon. And if you've ever read the story of Ezekiel's life, if you've ever read the book Ezekiel, you know that it paints this picture. It paints a picture of what life was like for the people of God living in captivity. You see what it was like for them to be removed from their homeland, to be cut off from their temple. It wasn't a pretty picture. Really quickly in Ezekiel's account of this season, you see how far the people of God have fallen from the life that God called them to live. We read these words beginning in Ezekiel 22 in verse 6. Every leader in Israel who lives within your walls is bent on murder. Fathers and mothers are treated with contempt. Foreigners are forced to pay for protection. Orphans and widows are wronged and oppressed among you. You despise holy things and violate the Sabbath day for rest. People accuse others falsely and they send them to their death. You are filled with idol worshipers and people who do obscene things. This is not a pretty picture. The people of Israel, they desire murder. They treat other people with disdain. People have to pay for their own protection to ensure their safety. The marginalized people in their society are dismissed and oppressed. The Sabbath is ignored. Innocent people are killed. And the list, it goes on and it goes on and on. And sure enough, that's what Ezekiel records. The verses that follow show that God is disgusted with the action of many of the men who are living in captivity, men who are driven by their lustful desires. They're driven to act out on their sexual desire. The state of God's people is in disarray. It's utterly heartbreaking. And while God touched on the action and the behaviors of some of the leaders in the first verses that we looked at, he circles back around later in chapter 22 to really hammer down on these leaders, making sure they know that the problem, it starts with them. This is what we read beginning in verse 26. Your priests, Ezekiel says, have violated my instruction and defiled holy things. They make no distinction between what is holy and what is not. He continues in verse 27. Your leaders are like wolves who tear apart victims. They actually destroy people's lives for money. And your prophets cover up for them. Like your prophets are part of the problem because they announce false visions, making lying predictions. I mean, this is not good for God's people. We read through this and it's pretty clear how far they have fallen from the standard that God has set for them. But yet, even in the midst of all of this behavior, God does what God does so well. God finds positivity in the midst of disarray, in the midst of disobedience. For God, there's a hopefulness. He looks at the situation and thinks, well, perhaps there's someone who is faithful among my people. Perhaps there's someone who can be the voice of God that Israel so desperately needs. The voice to call people back to God, back to the life that God wanted for them. Matter of fact, this is what we read in verse 30, same chapter. I looked for someone. God's like, I looked for someone who might rebuild the wall of righteousness that guards the land. I searched for someone to stand in the gap so that the wall wouldn't have to be destroyed in the land. But God says, I have found no one. I have searched high and I have searched low. I sought just one person who might help restore righteousness for my people. I looked for someone who would be willing to stand in the gap. I looked for someone who would be willing to mind the gap. Someone who could see potential dangers and who could help people navigate those dangers, navigate obstacles and hurdles in their life that prevents injury, that prevents them from falling further away from the life that God had called them to. Someone who could help them navigate from the direction they were going as a nation to the direction that God had called them as people. You know, today is Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. It's the day that we take some time to celebrate fathers, to acknowledge the importance of dads in the lives of their kids. And maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't. I shared this briefly last year, but the whole holiday of Father's Day has its roots in our state, in the state of Washington. In 1910, Sonora Dodd of Spokane, Washington, was sitting at church and listening to the pastor share a message about Mother's Day. And as that message wrapped up, she thought, this was incredible. This is a great day. It's a day for many years that had been set aside to celebrate moms. But she's thinking, we need a day for dads. We need a moment to remember and to thank and to be grateful for what dads do. And so immediately after this sermon, history has it that she would go to her pastor. And she would say to her pastor, look, this is what we need to do. I want us to have a day to say thank you to dads. In her mind, her intention was for that day to take place on June 5th of 1910. It was her dad's birthday. For her, it was an opportunity to remember her dad and do something special for him that she hoped would grow and become a bigger thing for all dads. And when she approached the pastor, you know what the pastor said? He said he didn't have time to write the message by the 5th. He didn't have time to plan the celebration. And so instead he said, what if we delay it a few more weeks? What if we do it on the 3rd Sunday of June? And sure enough, that's what stuck. That's why we have Father's Day on this weekend. It's because some pastor 100 years ago couldn't get his act together and write a sermon quick enough for us to do it on June 5th. Now you might be thinking, well, that's really cool, Mike. I mean, thanks for this nice historical lesson. Thanks for the detour, but what does this have to do with Ezekiel? What about him? Weren't we just talking about the deplorable state of the people of Israel? And the answer is yes, we were talking about Israel. Yes, we were talking about Ezekiel, and we still are. Because the thing is, even though we have fast forward 2,500 years from the moment that we were referring to in Ezekiel, even though the people were once brought back in the promised land, even though the people are no longer in captivity in Babylon, what God is looking for is the same. God is looking for people. Fathers, God is looking for dads to mind the gap, to be the kind of people that help our kids navigate the obstacles and hurdles of life, to help them, to point them towards Jesus. If you're a father that's tuning in this morning, I want you to know that not only is this day for you, but this message is for you. And I'm going to tell you, the rest of our time together, I'm going to say some things that you might not want to hear. But don't get discouraged, because it's meant to be an encouragement. It's meant to help paint a picture for all of us as dads who inevitably come up short. It's not only just being a dad thing, it's being a human thing. We all fall short of our intentions. But I hope to not only paint a picture, but to give us some guidance to become the kind of dads that our kids need, the kind of dads who are willing to mind the gap, the kind of dads who will be the kind of individuals that God's been looking for thousands of years. And so for the rest of our time together this morning, we're going to talk about three things. 3 ways that we can do this. 3 ways we can mind the gap for our kids. The first thing I want to talk about is the first thing we can do. We have to be willing to commit to lead our kids. You see, I really believe as fathers, we have a responsibility to lead with our faith. A common phrase that has been said and it's been passed down for generations and generations illustrates this truth, that faith is caught, not taught. Like our kids' faith, it's caught, not taught. By that I mean we lead our families by our example. The writer of Genesis puts it this way when he addresses Abraham in Genesis 18, beginning in verse 19. He says, I have singled him out. This is God referring to Abraham. I have singled him out so that he will direct his sons and their families to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. I, God, have called you, Abraham, out that you would direct your kids to keep the ways of the Lord. And the words that God shared with Abraham, it's just as applicable as us today. You see, God has called us to lead our families by our example as we live out our faith. This is so important. As we live out our faith in such a way that inspires, not requires, our kids to do the same. That we live out our faith in such a way that inspires, but it doesn't require our kids to do the same. It shouldn't surprise us that there is a high correlation between a father's intentional engagement in the lives of his kids and the success of these children as adults. You see, I really believe it's what we see in God, that we have a responsibility as dads to take our kids by the hand, to train them up to be strong adults, to train them up in the ways of the Lord, not only with our words, but probably even more importantly, with the way that we live out our lives, with the way that we embody our faith. It's a generational investment in our kids' lives, but also in our grandkids' lives and our great-grandkids' lives. And there's numerous biblical examples of this. Matter of fact, in 1 Kings chapter 15, this is what we read. Verse 11, Asa did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, as his ancestor David had done. You see, the author of Kings is acknowledging Asa's goodness, just like his great-grandfather David. And I really believe that this point is so significant. David's son Solomon was a good king. Solomon's son Rehoboam was not. And that shouldn't surprise us, because this is what we all know as parents. There is no guarantees in parenting. But the choices we make, the intentionality that we have, makes an impact that often outlives ourselves. You see, even though Asa's dad was not good, Asa had good men in his life, men who were committed to leading their families well, men who, more importantly, were committed to loving God well. And that investment set Asa up for success. You see, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Not only do we not know, but quite honestly, we can't control it either. What we can control is our actions. So let us intentionally choose to lead our kids well. Number 2, let us choose to love our kids. See, I really believe that nothing can replace a father's love. Daughters need their dad's love. Sons need their dad's love. Our love provides for our daughters and for our sons a model that they will seek to replicate in their own lives. Maybe another way of saying it is this way. The way that we love our children becomes the template for the love that they will look for in other relationships. Is that what we want for our kids? When we look at the way that we love our kids, acknowledging that it's a template for them to go out and seek love in others, are we satisfied with the level of love and care that we're providing for our kids? Now, we can say the word love, right? Love, it's a word that's thrown around a lot in our culture, but love begs the question, well, what is it? What is defined as love? And there's a lot of things that the world would say love is, but we have a great definition in the Bible. The Apostle Paul, in a letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth, would define what love is in 1 Corinthians 13, beginning in verse 4. And if you've ever been to a wedding, you've heard this passage. He would say, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous, nor boastful, or proud, or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable, and it keeps no record of wrong. Verse 7, love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. You see, the way that we love our kids should reflect Paul's words here in the letter that he wrote to Corinth. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read those words, it's both inspiring and, quite honestly, overwhelming. I mean, especially when I begin to hold it up to the reality of how I love my own kids. Love is patient. I don't like that one. I'm not always patient with my kids. Kind, I'm working on that one too. Love is not irritable. Am I the only one getting uncomfortable with Paul's list here? Needless to say, as fathers, I'm sure we have a lot of work to do on these categories. But here's the thing. Don't get discouraged. We are all a work in progress. And so let us choose today, or double down today, with intentionality that we will commit to loving our kids well, with enduring faith and hope, regardless of what our kids do. And we know our kids are going to do a lot to push our buttons. But can we love them like Paul calls us to love? Will we love our kids well? Number 3, and lastly, protect your kids. You see, I believe it's not enough for dads to lead well and love well. We also have to be willing to protect our kids. There's something innate in men that makes them suspicious of their daughter's boyfriends. Like, God built that into us. If you have a daughter at home, you know exactly what I'm talking about. My kids aren't in dating age yet, but I already know it's going to take a really special guy to get my approval to date, not only to then marry my daughter. It's part of how I protect my kids. It's part of this protective instinct that I have. And if you have sons, you know protection might look different, but there's innate instinct in all of us as dads to protect our kids. And if you're tuning in this morning and you call yourself a Christ follower, then you know that you have one of the greatest examples of a father who protects his kids, a father who's willing to provide and care for his own, and that is God. I mean, God sets the example. God shows us the way of what it looks like to be protective of the people that God has put in our lives, our kids, to care and to provide for them. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, God is encouraging his people with these words, beginning in verse 30. He says, "The Lord your God is going ahead of you. He will fight for you just as you saw him do in Egypt. And you saw how the Lord your God cared for you all along the way as you traveled through the wilderness, just as a father cares for his child." Again, God models for us what it looks like to go ahead of our children. We as dads are called to go ahead of our kids, to advocate for them, to defend them, to support them, to guard them. Not against everything that the world is going to throw their way. If we guarded them against everything the world had, that they would never grow up. They would never learn. They would never mature. We can't prevent them from going through wilderness seasons in their lives, but as dads, you know how we protect our kids? We follow God's example. We meet our kids in the wilderness. We meet them in their difficult times, and we walk difficult roads and seasons of life with them. That's what we do when we choose to protect our kids. Now, perhaps you're hearing all this, you're looking at this, and you're thinking, well, great. I'm a dad and I'm not doing any of these things well. Maybe you're looking at like I'm doing one of them well or two of them well, but you see room for growth in your own parenting. Whatever you walk away with this morning, I hope you walk away with this. Hope. That you wouldn't walk away from today feeling discouraged. Because here's what I know. Your kids, they love you. Your kids, they look to you. Your kids, they look up to you. And as a father, regardless of how much room we have to grow, the reality is we haven't failed. We haven't failed. Do you know why? Because there's still more time. Because we're not dead. And if we're not dead, then the truth is we're not done. And so there's work to do. All of us know that as fathers. There's work for us to do as dads. There's also time for us to begin to do the work. So let's commit on this Father's Day to go out and to be the kind of dads that our kids need. Let's choose to lead them well. Let's choose to love them fiercely and to protect them to the very end. Because after all, that's what dads do. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for your words to the prophet Ezekiel and the reminder that as dads, we're called to mind the gap. We're called to stand in and to help our kids, to shepherd them from one place to the next in a way that helps them learn and grow. And God, I know that for many of us as dads, we've tried, we've failed, we've succeeded, we've stubbed our toes. There's so much more room for growth. But God, I pray that we would commit to be the kind of dads you called us to be the kind of men you need us to be. Men who lead our kids well, who love them fearlessly, and who are willing to protect them to the very end. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for the great message, Mike. If you're new here at Lake Sawyer, we want to invite you to a very special event happening online. On June 23rd at 6 p.m., we're hosting an online dinner with our lead pastor called Next. This is a casual 10 to 20 minute talk held on Zoom where we will share a little bit about who we are and help you discover your next step at Lake Sawyer. When you complete your RSVP, we'll email a Zoom link and a calendar invitation. Plus, we'll even take care of dinner delivery for you. You can get your meal DoorDashed and take some time to sit down and chat with Mike instead of cooking or doing the dishes. To sign up, click the link in the chat channel or go to lakesawyerchurch.org/next. This past month, with our For Everyone campaign, we've done some creative things to show our gratitude for different groups of essential workers. Last week, in honor of medical workers, we partnered up with local business Hearts and Pearls to provide new medical masks that will be distributed to local healthcare professionals. Phased COVID guidelines brought a wave of reopened medical offices, and with this, we saw an opportunity to be more generous and extend the mask promotion for an additional week. But today is your last chance to make a donation toward this effort. So please take a minute and go to the website below to make a $10 donation or more towards masks for local healthcare workers. Together, let's show our gratitude to medical professionals right here in our own community. We hope you enjoyed this service. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we hope to see you next week.